The Last Ride. It was a cold, rainy night in a small town where the bus stop on Elm Street stood eerily silent. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting distorted shadows on the wet pavement. Emily, a college student returning from a late-night study session, stood alone at the stop, clutching her umbrella. Her phone buzzed, her mom reminding her not to miss the last bus. The air felt unusually heavy, and an unsettling stillness blanketed the street. Emily glanced at the bus schedule, 10:45 p.m. The last bus was supposed to arrive in 10 minutes. She checked her watch, 10:50 p.m. It was late. Just as she started to dial a cab, she heard it, the low hum of an engine. A dim pair of headlights emerged through the fog, and an old, rusted bus rolled up to the stop. The doors creaked open and a hunched driver with hollow eyes and a crooked smile greeted her. "Last ride of the night," he rasped. Despite her gut screaming at her to stay back, Emily hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The bus smelled of damp leather and something faintly metallic. There were only a few passengers, an old woman knitting, a man in a trench coat reading a newspaper, and a young boy staring blankly out the window. None of them acknowledged her. Emily sat near the middle, gripping her bag tightly. The bus jolted forward and the windows fogged up, obscuring the view outside. Minutes passed and Emily noticed something strange. The bus wasn't stopping. No matter how many stops they passed, the driver didn't slow down. She leaned forward, calling out, "Excuse me, aren't we stopping at Oak Street?" The driver didn't respond. The passengers turned their heads in unison to look at her. Their eyes were glassy, lifeless, and their expressions unnervingly blank. Emily's heart pounded as she realized they weren't breathing. Panic set in. She stood up, ready to demand the driver stop. But the bus suddenly veered into a narrow, unlit road that wasn't on the route. The engine growled louder, and the windows turned pitch black, as if the outside world had disappeared. The old woman's knitting needles clattered to the floor, and she whispered, "You shouldn't have boarded." Emily's knees buckled, and she grabbed the nearest pole for support. The bus screeched to a halt in front of a decrepit building. The driver turned to her, his face now grotesque and inhuman. "End of the line," he hissed. The doors swung open, revealing a dark void instead of a road. The passengers stood up and began walking toward the exit, their bodies contorting unnaturally. Emily backed away, her screams swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Just as one of the passengers reached for her, Emily felt herself yanked backward. She hit the ground hard and opened her eyes to see a concerned cab driver leaning over her. "You okay, miss?" he asked. "Saw you lying on the sidewalk near the bus stop. Looked like you fainted." Shaking, Emily looked around. The bus stop was empty and there was no sign of the old bus. Her phone buzzed. It was her mom again, asking if she'd gotten home safely. She never took the bus again, but every now and then she'd hear the faint hum of an engine late at night, and a chill would run down her spine. The end. The Last Ride. Part 2. A week had passed since that terrifying night on the bus, and Emily thought she had put it behind her. She hadn't told anyone about the strange experience. No one would believe her anyway. But the memories lingered, haunting her every time she walked near the bus stop on Elm Street. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a deep orange, Emily found herself walking home after another late study session. She passed the familiar bus stop, now bathed in the eerie glow of streetlights. Her heart skipped a beat as she remembered that night, but she quickly dismissed the thought. It was just a nightmare, nothing more. But as she walked past, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. A cold breeze whipped through the air, sending shivers down her spine. She quickened her pace, eager to get home. That's when she heard it, the unmistakable hum of an engine, low and distant but growing louder with each passing second. Turning, Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. The same old bus was approaching, the headlights cutting through the mist. Her legs froze, rooted to the ground, and for a moment she wondered if she was losing her mind. The bus slowed to a stop right in front of her. The doors creaked open with the same unsettling groan. She stood there, frozen, unable to move. "Going my way?" the driver's voice rasped. His eyes were empty, just like she remembered. Emily's heart raced. She turned to run, but the street behind her was now a blur, like she was trapped in a nightmare. She couldn't escape. Before she could react, a voice behind her called out, "Emily, don't get on that bus!" She whipped around, and there, standing in the rain, was the old woman from the bus. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was holding her knitting, but her hands were shaking violently. "The bus doesn't take you where you think it does," the old woman said, her voice trembling. "It's a trap. Once you board, you never leave." Emily took a step back, her mind racing. "What are you talking about?" The old woman's face twisted in anguish. "I made the mistake of getting on years ago. I've been trapped in that bus, never aging, never leaving, and now they've come for you." Emily's eyes darted back to the bus, and she saw the other passengers, their faces twisted into grotesque, vacant expressions. The boy who had stared out the window was now standing, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Don't get on," the old woman pleaded. "You can't escape once it starts moving. I've tried to warn others, but no one listens." Emily's mind was in a whirlwind. She had to leave, but she was too afraid to move. Her body felt paralyzed, as if the very air around her was thickening, trapping her in place. Then she heard the sound of footsteps. A figure appeared from the fog, a tall, thin man in a dark suit. His face was pale, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. He stepped toward her with unnatural speed. "You should have gotten on the bus, dear," the man said in a low, menacing tone. "Now you'll never escape." Before Emily could react, the old woman reached out, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. "Run!" she shouted, her voice desperate. "Don't look back!" In a panic, Emily wrenched her arm free and bolted down the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She dared not look behind her, but the sound of the bus's engine roared in her ears. She ran, faster than she ever had before, until she reached her apartment building. Panting and terrified, she slammed the door behind her and locked it. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone. She dialed the police, but when the operator answered, the line went dead. The room felt suffocating, and her eyes darted to the window. Outside, the bus was waiting, parked across the street, its headlights glowing ominously in the dark. The driver's eyes locked with hers through the window. Emily backed away, but she knew she was not safe. The bus was always there, always waiting for her to return. The nightmare was far from over. To be continued. The Last Ride. Part 3. The days blurred together after that night. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she looked out her apartment window, the bus was there, parked across the street, its headlights dimly glowing in the dark. The driver's eyes always seemed to find hers, no matter where she was in her apartment. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. The terror that gripped her heart was unrelenting. No matter how many locks she checked or how tightly she pulled the blinds, she knew the bus was waiting. And the old woman's warning echoed in her mind. Once you board, you never leave. Emily tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. She hadn't seen the bus again after that night. But every time she walked near the bus stop on Elm Street, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The air would grow colder, the street lights would flicker, and she could hear the faint hum of the engine, distant but growing louder. One evening, as Emily was heading to the grocery store, she passed the bus stop again. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. There, parked at the curb, was the bus, just as she remembered. The doors creaked open slowly, and the driver's hollow eyes locked onto hers. It was calling her. Before she could react, a familiar voice echoed in the air. "Emily!" She spun around, relief flooding through her as she saw the old woman again, standing at the far end of the street. "You have to listen to me. They'll take you if you get on." Emily's heart raced. She took a step back, her feet feeling like they were sinking into the pavement. The old woman rushed toward her, her hands shaking. "You're the only one who can stop it. You have to break the cycle before it's too late." But the words felt like they were slipping away, lost in the cold, heavy fog that seemed to be swallowing the street. The bus driver smiled a twisted grin, and the other passengers, those lifeless, empty-eyed figures, were beginning to step off the bus. Emily turned to run, but before she could take another step, the old woman grabbed her arm. "Please, don't go near them." In that moment, everything seemed to go still. The sound of the bus's engine faded into silence. The streetlights flickered and died. The fog grew thicker, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The old woman's voice dropped to a whisper. "They don't just take you to a different place, Emily. They take you to a different time. A place where you'll never grow old. A place where you'll be trapped forever." Emily's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" The old woman's face contorted in pain, and she whispered, "I was like you once. I thought I could outrun it, that I could escape. But they took me, and now I'm one of them, one of the passengers, forever waiting for someone else to make the same mistake I did." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She felt a sudden surge of anger and desperation. "I'm not like you. I'm not going to let them take me." But the old woman shook her head, her voice trembling. "It's not up to you. It's never been up to us. They've already chosen you." Before Emily could respond, the figure of the tall, thin man in the dark suit appeared behind the old woman. His sunglasses gleamed in the darkness, and his smile was chilling. "The bus is waiting, Emily," he said in a voice as cold as ice. "Time's up." The old woman turned toward the man, her face contorted with fear. "No, please, let her go." But the man ignored her. He reached for Emily, his cold fingers brushing against her arm. In an instant, the world around her began to warp and twist. The street, the bus stop, the old woman, all of it seemed to dissolve into a dark, swirling vortex. Emily screamed, but her voice was drowned by the growing roar of the bus's engine. The man's grip tightened, pulling her toward the open doors of the bus. The other passengers stood in the doorway, their hollow eyes staring at her, waiting. With a final desperate cry, Emily yanked herself free from the man's grasp and stumbled backward. She collided with the old woman, knocking them both to the ground. "No, we can still stop it," the old woman shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the bus. But Emily knew it was too late. The doors of the bus slammed shut and the engine roared to life once more. As the bus began to move, Emily's heart sank. She looked out through the misty windows and saw the old woman standing in the street, her face filled with a mix of sadness and resignation. Emily tried to scream, to run, but the bus pulled away faster and faster, until the world outside the window faded into darkness. To be continued.